He walked in the way Anthony Hopkins walks into every room, with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who has long since stopped needing to announce himself. There is no performance in his entrance, no calibrated charm, no careful management of first impression. He simply arrives and the room adjusts to him rather than the other way around, the way rooms adjust to weather not because they have been commanded to, but because something in the atmosphere has shifted and the adjustment is simply the natural response. He came through the late show curtain at 86 years old with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to be still inside the storm, settled into the guest chair with the contained precision of someone for whom every movement was a decision, and looked at Stephen Colbert with those extraordinary eyes that had spent 8 decades accumulating the specific, irreplaceable knowledge that only a long life lived fully and attentively can produce. The audience applauded with the particular reverence reserved for people who have become, over time, something larger than celebrity, not a star, a presence, a fact of the culture, one of the handful of people alive about whom it can be said, without exaggeration, that the art form they practiced was permanently changed by their having practiced it. Stephen greeted him with genuine warmth. The band played, and for the first several minutes the conversation moved with the careful, intelligent pleasure of two people who respected each other's intelligence and were finding out, in real time, where the conversation wanted to go. They talked about the new work. There was always new work, because Anthony Hopkins was constitutionally incapable of stopping, a fact that said something important about the relationship between his identity and his craft. They talked about what it meant to still be finding things inside characters at 86 that surprised him, things that younger actors with fewer tools and less damage couldn't have reached. They talked about whales, about the specific quality of light there, about the particular way a place of origin shapes a person's interior architecture in ways they spend their whole life discovering. He was precise and generous and occasionally funny in the dry, unexpected way that people are funny when humor isn't a performance but a way of seeing. And then Stephen set down his note cards. "Sir Anthony," he said, "I want to ask you something, not about a specific film, not about craft or technique or process, something more personal." Hopkins looked at him, the eyes steady and watchful, and behind the watchfulness something that might have been curiosity. "Go ahead," he said simply. "When you look back," Stephen said, "over 80 years of a life and 60 years of a career, what is the thing you spent the longest time trying to prove, and to whom?" The question landed in the room and sat there for a moment. Hopkins regarded it the way he regarded everything, without hurry, without performance, with the specific quality of attention that had made him one of the greatest actors who had ever lived. "There was a man," Hopkins said finally. His voice was different from the way it had been a moment before, still that extraordinary instrument, still carrying the Welsh valleys in its lower registers, but stripped of something, stripped of the professional polish that usually governed it in public. "A director. I was in my 20s, just starting. Wales behind me, Rada behind me, the future entirely unclear. He was directing a production I was in, a significant production, the kind that could matter, the kind that a young actor needed to matter." He paused. "And after a rehearsal one afternoon he pulled me aside. He was not a cruel man, I want to be clear about that. He was a serious man who believed in plain speaking, which can sometimes arrive with the same impact as cruelty without any of the intent. And he said to me," Hopkins stopped, started again, "You have considerable technical ability, you have intelligence, you have physical presence. But I need to tell you something that I believe will be more useful to you than any praise. You will never be a truly great actor, because great acting requires love. The capacity to love the characters, the audience, the work, the human beings around you, and that capacity in you is," he paused, "is not fully developed." The studio was completely still. "What did you do?" Stephen asked softly. "I thanked him," Hopkins said, "because that's what you do when someone in authority says something to you in that tone. You thank them and you leave the room. And then I went home and he stopped. I was devastated, not because I thought he was entirely wrong. That was the particular sting of it. If I had been certain he was wrong, I could have dismissed it, but I wasn't certain. I was 20-something years old and I was already aware that there was something in me that was contained, armored. That the access to certain emotional territories was restricted in ways I didn't fully understand and couldn't easily change." He looked at his hands. "And I made a decision," Hopkins said. "Not consciously, not as a stated intention, but a decision nonetheless, the kind that shapes everything afterward. I decided I was going to prove him wrong, not by becoming a different person, by making the work so undeniably, irrefutably present that the question of whether love was in it would become irrelevant. I was going to outcraft him. I was going to out-technique him." I was going to make performances so precisely constructed that nobody would be able to look at them and say, there is no love here. Stephen was very still. Did it work? He asked. Brilliantly, Hopkins said, the faintest, driest trace of irony. For about 40 years, the work became extraordinary. I'm not being falsely modest about that. The technique, the precision, the ability to construct a character from the outside and when I couldn't always access it from the inside out, that became a genuine skill. A genuine contribution to the art form. Hannibal Lecter, Nixon, Stevens in The Remains of the Day. All of those characters that people remember, all of that came from the same engine. The engine of proving that one man wrong. He paused. And then something happened, Hopkins said, slowly in my 60s, 70s after he stopped. After I got sober, after I started doing the work of understanding who I actually was rather than who I was performing being, and I started to understand that the director had been describing something real, not a permanent condition, not an immutable fact about my character. But something real that had been there, that had shaped the armor and the technique and the determination and the engine of proof. He looked up. He had been describing a man who was afraid to love because loving meant exposure, meant vulnerability, meant giving something away that might not come back, and I had been afraid of exactly that for most of my life. The first tear came then, small, quiet, sitting on Anthony Hopkins's face with the same contained precision that characterized everything he did. The awards came, Hopkins said. The recognition came, the undeniability came, and I would think there it is, proof, and then I would go home and the proof didn't feel like proof. It felt like evidence of the technique, not evidence of the love, because the love, he stopped. Because I still hadn't found it. I had built the most elaborate possible structure around the absence of the thing, but the absence was still there. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Stephen stood up from behind his desk without announcement and walked around to sit on the edge of it, facing Hopkins directly. He said nothing for a moment. He simply moved closer. When did it change? Stephen asked. When did the love arrive? Hopkins looked at him, and something moved across his face, complicated and slow, the way things move in faces that have spent 80 years learning to control what shows. My wife, he said, Stella, and it wasn't sudden, it was gradual, the way the important things are gradual, and therapy, years of it, and the sobriety which opened up things that the drinking had been keeping closed, and age, simply age, which has a way of making the armor feel less necessary because the things you were armoring against start to feel less threatening. He paused. And at some point in my 70s, I looked at a script for a film, and I felt something that I hadn't felt before, or hadn't felt and acknowledged before. Something that was not technique, not precision, not the engine of proof. Something that was, he stopped. Something that was simply care for the character, for what the character was carrying, for what the story was trying to say. And I thought, oh, so this is what he was talking about. Both eyes were wet now. He made no move to conceal it. I thought about that director for the first time in years, Hopkins said. I hadn't thought about him consciously. The engine had been running so long on its own momentum that I'd forgot what had started it. And I thought about what he'd said. And I thought he was right. He was describing something true. In the 60 years between his observation and my understanding of it, all of that time, all of that work, all of those performances, were the long way around to a simple destination. He looked at Stephen. He was trying to tell me to learn to love, Hopkins said. And instead of learning to love, I spent 60 years building a monument to proving I didn't need to, and the monument was the faintest smile. The monument was magnificent. I'm genuinely proud of the monument, but the monument is not the same as the thing it was supposed to replace. Stephen looked at him steadily. Anthony, he said, I want to say something. The work you did, the technique, the precision, the extraordinary performances built on the engine of proof, that work has moved millions of people. It has changed what they understood about human beings and the human condition. Whatever was inside you or not inside you when you made it, it produced something real and lasting and genuinely important. The director was describing a limitation. What you did with the limitation was not limited. Hopkins looked at him. And the second thing I want to say, Stephen continued, is that what you just told me, the fact that you found it, that in your 70s and your 80s the love arrived, that the armor came down, that the thing the director said you lacked, you developed it. Slowly, the hard way, through sobriety and honesty and the specific courage of actually looking at yourself rather than constructing elaborate proofs about yourself. He paused. That is not a consolation prize, that is the main event. The performances were extraordinary, but becoming someone who could love, that was the work that mattered most. Something broke open in Anthony Hopkins's face then, not dramatically, quietly. The particular way things break open in a man who has spent 80 years learning to contain himself and has finally, in the right room with the right person asking the right question, decided that containment is no longer required. I would like to tell him, Hopkins said. His voice was rough. The director, he passed many years ago, but I would like to tell him that he was right, and that I spent 60 years being furious about it, and that the fury produced extraordinary things, and that eventually I found my way to the thing he was pointing at. He paused. And that it was worth finding, even this late, even the long way around, it was worth finding. He looked out at the audience, not performing for them, simply including them in something. If someone has ever told you something true about yourself that you weren't ready to hear, Hopkins said, and you've spent years or decades building elaborate proofs against it, stop. The proof is never the point. The point is the thing they were trying to tell you. Go find it, even if it takes 60 years, even if the route is ridiculous. Even if you have to win every award your industry gives before you're willing to sit still long enough to understand what a young director in a rehearsal room was trying to say to a frightened young man from Wales. He paused. Go find the love, whatever that means for you, go find it. The applause that followed was the kind that comes when something true has been said in a room and the room knows it. Not celebratory, reverential. The recognition of something that had been carried for a very long time and had finally been set down. Anthony Hopkins had walked onto The Late Show as one of the greatest actors in the history of cinema. He walked out as something more important, a man who had spent 60 years proving he didn't need love and had spent the last decade learning that he did and finding it anyway. The monument was magnificent, but the man inside it was what mattered. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered what it was for.